Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open a chapter of history that's rarely whispered about in textbooks, but was very much alive in candlelit corners and shadowy cloisters. Lust, sex, and sin in the Middle Ages. And before we begin, just a heads up, you probably wouldn't survive this. Not because it's too spicy, well maybe, but because if you'd lived in medieval times with even a curious mind and a slightly active libido, chances are you'd have ended up in the stocks, whipped, or burned, maybe all three, depending on the week. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know, what city are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. We begin not in a sultry tavern, but in a monastery. Not exactly where you'd expect to find sin. The air smells like candle wax, damp stone, and something faintly medicinal. It's eerily quiet, the kind of quiet where every cough feels like a thunderclap. But even here, behind thick walls and layers of vows, desire flickers like a stubborn flame. The monks wear wool robes and have their hair shaved in a circle, known as the tonsure. They've sworn off the pleasures of the flesh. Lust is the enemy here, a prowling beast. Yet, you notice Brother Thomas avoids Sister Agnes' gaze a bit too obviously. His fingers twitch when she passes. She, in turn, clutches her rosary tighter than seems strictly necessary. This isn't some one-off scandal. Medieval monasteries were battlefields of the body. Monks and nuns fought exhausting wars with their own thoughts. Sex was seen as the original spiritual enemy, and it couldn't be banished by cold baths or fasting alone. Confessionals were filled with slippery accidents, stained garments from dreams, and awkward moments with saint statues that didn't age well. Monks kept detailed, painfully honest records. One 12th century abbot confessed that the devil showed him visions of naked women during prayer. Yes, in church. He was so tormented, he once rammed his face into the cold floor to calm himself. Didn't work. Some monasteries became infamous for their not-so-holy behavior. In one 11th century French double monastery, both male and female communities were caught in a very real entanglement. The church responded by shutting the place down and labeling it a brothel in disguise. Ironically, monastic life was sold as an escape from sin. Take vows, eat bland food, chant in Latin, shave your head. It was supposed to help. But the isolation often made things worse. Long hours with your thoughts and the looming expectation of purity, it was an erotic pressure cooker. Nuns struggled too, and they wrote about it. Sometimes in code, sometimes not. One 14th century nun described nightmares of being seduced by black beasts with burning breath. Classic incubus imagery, and begged God to harden her soul. Some historians believe calling it a demon was just a safer way to say, I'm horny and I hate it. Some monks practiced dream control, like medieval lucid dreaming, to keep lustful thoughts out of their sleep. One claimed he could recite psalms in his dreams to drown out seductive imagery. Who knows if it worked, but it shows how desperate they were. Despite the rules, many monks and nuns had secret relationships. There were smuggled letters, midnight visits, hidden tunnels, even pregnancies. Some convents quietly sent pregnant nuns away, and the babies were adopted or abandoned. The official excuse? Miraculous conception, or trickery by the devil. Sure, Jan. Of course, some monks were truly devout and managed to suppress desire. Saints were praised for never having a sexual thought. But did they really? Or were they just good at hiding it, or redefining purity in their journals? Your stay in a monastery leaves you with a strange mix of awe and sympathy. These people were told that even thinking about sex could mean damnation. That's a crushing burden, especially when people are going to people. Even in 1142, you leave the monastery as the vespers begin, chant rising like smoke behind you. The moon hangs low. A night bird calls. You head deeper into the medieval world, where the line between holiness and horniness keeps blurring. Next stop, the saints. Saints weren't immune to lust. In fact, many of them spent years locked in deeply personal, sometimes erotic showdowns with the devil and occasionally with God. You read saintly biographies, Vedas, the church called them. These weren't dry moral summaries. They were spiritual dramas, seductions, naked visions, torments, and ecstasies that got confusingly close to the other kind. Saint Anthony fled to the desert to escape temptation and got visions of shimmering women throwing themselves at him. He dove into a thorn bush to resist. Literally. And female saints? Even stranger. Saint Catherine of Siena took a vow of virginity at 7 and later claimed she was married to Christ, with a ring made of his foreskin. Yes, his foreskin. Saint Teresa of Avila, technically post-medieval, but spiritually relevant, described an angel piercing her heart with a flaming spear, leaving her in ecstasy that sounded suspiciously like something out of a romance novel. Some scholars believe she was having out-of-body orgasmic experiences, just without the vocabulary to name them. These weren't fringe tales. They were widely read and used as spiritual instruction. The lesson, spiritual purity, required confronting lust, sometimes by enduring surreal, nearly sensual torments. And sometimes the saints enjoyed it. Saint Lardus described a vision where Christ kissed her on the mouth, caressed her heart, and flooded her with warmth and divine music. Symbolic? Maybe. The only acceptable way for a woman to express intense pleasure? Almost definitely. Some historians argue these visions were the only safe space women had to express desire. A kind of spiritual drag show, slipping into roles society allowed, using divine ecstasy to channel what they couldn't openly say. Even the language of these visions mirrored erotic tropes: breathlessness, swooning, surrender. Reading them starts to feel like reading a romance novel. You duck into a chapel and see a mural of Saint Margaret holding a dragon by the tail. Not the most innocent image. Everything in this era had double meanings. Some saints didn't make it out unscathed. Saint Christina the Astonishing, yes, that was her real title, was said to levitate, throw herself into furnaces, and dive into icy rivers to fight temptation. Her story sounds like a fever dream. Some think she had epilepsy. Others think she was just trying to survive a world that punished both repression and expression. These stories weren't just devotional. They were cautionary tales, survival guides, wish fulfillment, and honestly, slightly erotic fan fiction for people who couldn't read the Canterbury Tales without blushing. By now, saints seem less like flawless icons and more like exhausted humans wrestling with overwhelming impulses. Even the most divine couldn't escape desire. They just found more poetic ways to deal with it. Next, you enter the glittering halls of courtly love, where knights pine, ladies plot, and no one actually gets laid. Inside the castle, the air is warm with roasted meats, spiced wine, and the sound of lutes and low poetry. Welcome to the theater of flirtation. A knight kneels before a lady, praises her eyes and grace. She smiles faintly, kindness or cruelty. You can't tell. They exchange tokens, gloves, scarves, locks of hair. But if he thinks that gets him into her chambers, think again. Courtly love was about the longing, not the having. Wanting was nobler than getting. Troubadours sang of unattainable women, and their tortured love shaped real, noble behavior. Ladies flirted just enough to keep control. Knights performed absurd feats for a single smile. Fulfillment ruined the illusion. But beneath the surface, affairs happened. Noble marriages were political. Real love had to be found elsewhere. In Eleanor of Aquitaine's court, ladies debated love like it was The Bachelor. All very polite, until you realized most of them were having affairs. The rules said courtly love had to remain non-physical. That kept it from being sinful. The church wasn't thrilled, but as long as it was cloaked in soul talk and metaphor, it was tolerated. And it was all metaphor. Instead of they slept together, medieval texts said things like he took shelter in her garden. Subtle. You realize this whole culture is a masquerade. Lust was a mask of longing. Everyone's pretending to be above it, while quietly negotiating access to it. Finally, you leave the castle for a village. No velvet, no lute music, just damp earth with smoke, livestock. Peasant life. Cramped cottages, no privacy, and one bed shared by parents, kids, and sometimes a goat. Yet love and lust thrive here too. In some places, there was bundling, a tradition where courting teens lay in bed together, clothed, separated by a board or sack. They were supposed to talk, but they were teenagers. You do the math. If pregnancy happened, shotgun weddings followed. The community judged everything. Reputation mattered. Village women even checked wedding night sheets for signs of consummation. Some clever brides probably pre-stained them. Sex here wasn't about poetry. It was practical. Sometimes tender, sometimes hurried, sometimes behind haystacks or in the woods. Punishments for transgressions existed, but often it was handled within the community. Everyone knew desire didn't wait for the church's blessing. Here is the rewritten transcript section with all timestamps removed and the flow preserved. You witness a strange custom called chivalry, where a man who married a much younger woman, or someone suspected of infidelity, is paraded through the village on a donkey while people bang pots and yell insults. It's half punishment, half performance, and reeks of petty vengeance disguised as moral outrage. Still, there's humor here, too, a kind of earthy acceptance. One local midwife, a stout woman with a gap-toothed smile, pulls you aside and says, "The Lord can keep his sermons. Babies come when they want." She's attended dozens of births, some for married couples, some not, and doesn't seem particularly scandalized by any of it. She even jokes about how many noblemen have left their blessings in village cradles. And yes, that's a thing. Noblemen would sometimes use their power to take advantage of peasant girls, leading to awkwardly mixed-status children who were either quietly absorbed into the village fabric or not so quietly cast out. One thing that stands out is how marriage itself isn't always a grand event down here. Sometimes it's just a handshake in front of witnesses, a verbal agreement that they'll share work, food, and a bed. The church wanted a priest involved, of course, but in many cases, local custom ruled the day. If you lived together, if everyone saw you as a couple, then that was that. Marriage by consensus, surprisingly flexible, until it wasn't. There's always someone watching from the margins. You meet an old widow who whispers about the woods women, young girls who disappeared into the forest to avoid shame after pregnancy, or who practice their own kind of folk magic to control fertility. There are herbs passed in secret, teas that bring on the moon, and charms tied under skirts. Some of it's practical, some superstition. All of it reveals how deeply women tried to maintain control in a world that often denied them agency. And here's a quirky fact. In some parts of medieval Europe, young couples would carve love runes into tree bark, not just as a romantic gesture, but as a kind of spiritual insurance policy. If they couldn't afford a priest's blessing, the tree would do. It was natural, eternal, and frankly, more available than a bishop. You pass one such tree, hearts carved into the bark, initials barely legible, and wonder how many generations of secret love stories it's absorbed. Scholars still argue about just how common sex before marriage was among peasants. Some point to church records full of fines and punishments. Others say those records only show the rare cases that cause scandal. What's clear is that the rules on paper and the reality in the field rarely lined up. Desire finds cracks. It grows in the shadows. And in medieval villages, it shaped lives in ways more honest and sometimes more humane than all the noble poetry in the world. You leave the village behind, your boots muddy, your mind swirling with images of flickering hearths, whispered promises, and stolen kisses behind barn doors. The peasants may not have had silks or ballads, but they had passion, risk, and moments of tenderness carved into the bark of trees. Next, you're heading back to the cloisters, but this time, the women are running the show. Nuns with ink-stained fingers and some surprisingly spicy secrets. You step through a creaking wooden gate into the walled stillness of a convent, half expecting to be met with angelic chanting and the scent of incense. Instead, you're greeted by the sharp tang of vinegar and a surprising note of roasted onions drifting from the kitchen garden. The air is clean but thick with unspoken stories. Nuns glide across the courtyard with practiced grace, habits flapping in a breeze, eyes lowered, hands folded. Yet behind the serenity, there's a pulse. Something vibrant and human beats beneath the linen and Latin. You can almost feel it. Inside the convent walls, it's supposed to be a sanctuary from sin, a haven from temptation, a place where women devote themselves entirely to God. And sure, on the surface, everything follows the script. There are prayers, chants, hours of silence, and manuscripts copied with almost obsessive precision. But soon, you realize this place is far more than a retreat from the flesh. It's a community of women, thinking, feeling, dreaming, and yes, occasionally fantasizing, just like everyone else in medieval society. And they kept records. You find yourself in the convent library, where the air smells of old parchment and beeswax. One of the sisters, older and quietly amused by your curiosity, unlocks a cabinet and shows you something few outsiders ever see: the private writings of nuns. Not doctrine, not psalters, not dry theological commentary. What she lays before you are diaries, fragile collections of yearning, shame, visions, and desire scribbled between prayers and poems. Some of it's spiritual, yes, but not always the way you'd expect. One entry describes a dream where the writer sees the Virgin Mary cradling her with a tenderness that sounds less like maternal comfort and more like an overwhelming wave of bliss. Another recounts being kissed on the mouth by an angel again and again until she wakes up gasping, convinced she's either blessed or damned, and you're not sure which one she wants more. One nun writes about a fellow sister's golden hair, like summer wheat, and the gentle weight of her hand during prayer. It reads like longing, quiet, intimate, almost mournful. It never says anything overt, but the undertones are undeniable. And it turns out this wasn't an isolated case. In convents across Europe, from England to Italy, scholars have found letters and poems passed between women, sometimes coded, sometimes shockingly direct. One nun in Germany wrote of her hunger for the warmth of Sister Clara's body. Another in France confessed that she sought God's mercy for dreaming of carnal joy while sharing a bed in winter. Wait, sharing a bed? Oh yes. Convent dormitories were communal, often with 2 or more nuns per straw mattress in colder seasons. It was practical, economical, and in some cases, an unexpected invitation for intimacy. While rules forbade physical affection, enforcement was inconsistent. After all, there are no cameras or DNA tests, just a lot of dim candlelight, heavy robes, and human need. Not everything was hidden. Some abbesses kept astonishingly honest records of misbehavior. One case details a nun caught with a visiting monk under a staircase. Another tells of a local butcher's daughter smuggled into the grounds disguised as a laundry assistant. In most cases, punishment meant temporary seclusion, extra prayers, and a stern talk. But if noble families were involved, scandals were often buried entirely. There were love tokens, too. Small crosses, carved charms, notes tucked into rosary pouches. One nun buried a letter beneath the roots of a cherry tree addressed to the one whose voice haunts me in sleep. She never signed it. She didn't have to. Everyone in the convent knew. But it wasn't always about sex or forbidden love. Many of these women were intellectual powerhouses, starved for stimulation. They read everything: Augustine, Plato, even Roman poets if they could get away with it. They debated theology late into the night, translated texts, and wrote mystical reflections that, when you squint just a little, sound like erotic poetry disguised in the language of piety. One visionary nun describes her soul being pierced by a divine flame and open like a flower to the light. If that's not metaphorical foreplay, you don't know what is. Here's your fringe fact for the night. Hildegard of Bingen, the famous 12th century abbess, composer, and mystic, once wrote that a woman's soul could become pregnant with divine inspiration, an idea that some modern readers interpret as spiritual queerness. She also had an intense, possibly romantic bond with another nun named Richardes, which ended in a heartbroken flurry of letters when Richardes was transferred to another convent. Hildegard's grief reads like a breakup album in Latin. Modern scholars still debate what all of this means. Were these relationships romantic? Platonic? Emotional coping mechanisms in an all-female environment? Did nuns understand their own desires in the way we frame sexuality today? There's no single answer. What's clear is that these women lived full, complex, emotional lives, far from the image of passive, celibate angels the church preferred to project. You also learn that many women didn't choose the convent freely. Families often sent daughters there as a financial decision or political strategy. If you weren't beautiful enough to marry advantageously or had too many sisters ahead of you, off to the nunnery you went. Some embraced it, others didn't. One diary has a single heartbreaking line, "I do not love my vows, but I obey them." It hits harder than any sermon. Let's not forget the occasional outliers, the rebellious nuns who snuck out of the convent at night, visited taverns, and even took lovers. In 14th century Italy, one group of nuns was discovered hosting masked dances in their cloister, complete with hired musicians. When church officials arrived, they found wine, laughter, and a suspicious lack of guilt. The women were reprimanded, of course, but not expelled. Why? Because some of them were related to bishops. Surprise! As you walk back through the cloisters, moonlight falling through arched windows, you hear the echo of a hymn rising from the chapel. It's beautiful, haunting, but layered beneath the melody is the undeniable truth that these women, so often imagined as blank slates of virtue, were just as full of longing, conflict, imagination, and secrets as anyone else. Maybe even more so, tucked away from the world with only candlelight and each other for company. In medieval times, confession was a complex ritual, often more about control than absolution. Women, in particular, sometimes preferred confessing to another woman, especially about sins involving the body, like sensual dreams of Saint Sebastian, because a fellow woman might understand in ways a young priest could not. Yet, the church wielded immense power as the keeper of secrets, knowing who slept where, who loved whom, and who desired what. This knowledge was used to maintain moral order, but also to exert influence. A noble confessing adultery might be nudged to fund a chapel. A baker frequenting a brothel could lose his market stall. Guilt was currency. Historians debate whether the confessional was a space for spiritual healing or a tool of psychological surveillance, fostering obsession with moral failings. Some argue it offered relief, a rare outlet for unspoken burdens. Likely it was both, a therapy session, a trap, a release, and a risk. Leaving the confessional, with the creaking wood and tolling bells, you'd sense that sin wasn't just an act but a story, shaping communities through whispered gossip and scandal. In the town square, private sins became public spectacles. Crowds gathered, buzzing with anticipation, around a wooden platform where a woman in her 30s, accused of adultery, stood furious in freshly oiled stocks. The man involved was absent, typical of the era's double standards. Rotten vegetables flew as villagers, from children to drunk cobblers, jeered. This wasn't justice, it was theater, a mix of cruelty and entertainment. Public punishments for sexual sins, adultery, fornication, or even bold speech were common. Penalties ranged from fines to whippings, exile, or branding, with women, especially married ones, facing harsher consequences. A man might be fined for visiting prostitutes, but a woman labeled as one could be whipped or forced to wear striped hoods, a medieval scarlet letter. In one case, a man was humiliated for cross-dressing while cleaning, pelted with dung for defying gender norms. Another woman, running an unofficial brothel, was paraded with a sign reading "Mother of Whores." Even flirtatious remarks, like calling an apprentice ripe fruit, could land someone in the pillory if overheard by the wrong ears. Scholars debate whether these punishments deterred sin or served as a pressure valve, reinforcing norms through ritualistic shaming. Some see them as unifying spectacles, where collective judgment absolved personal guilt. Others view them as raw displays of power, reminding everyone who set the rules. As the crowd dispersed, the woman in the stocks stared silently, the moment fading as life resumed. Darker still were trials where lust was demonized. In a village thick with fear, a widow named Isabeau, an herbalist, faced accusations of consorting with a demon. Her knowledge and independence made her a target. The priest, theatrical in his righteousness, detailed her alleged unholy acts, claiming she enjoyed them, a dangerous admission. Inquisition records brim with accounts of women describing nocturnal visits from incubi, demons who seduced or assaulted. These stories, shaped by fear, dreams, or torture, often reflected suppressed desires or societal panic. Physical inspections for witches' marks like freckles sealed fates. Scholars argue whether these women believed their confessions were coerced or were simply scapegoats for defying female norms. Lust was an easy accusation, salacious and unprovable, targeting autonomous women like healers or midwives. Chastity belts, another symbol of control, may be more myth than reality. Ornate and impractical, many surviving examples are likely Renaissance forgeries or Victorian fantasies. Yet, the idea fit a culture obsessed with female virginity as a commodity. Manuscripts mention jealous husbands commissioning belts, some spiked to punish rather than prevent. Male chastity devices existed too, for penance or revenge. Whether widely used or not, the belts loomed large in medieval imagination, mocked in poetry and ballads where women outsmarted them. Scholars see them as metaphors for control, their threat more real than their use. Weddings, too, were battlegrounds of desire and duty. Bedding ceremonies turned private moments into public spectacles, with onlookers ensuring consummation to validate marriages. Economic and political alliances, not romantic unions. Bridal sheets were inspected for blood to prove virginity, with clever brides using animal blood or bribes to fake it. Men faced no such scrutiny. They were expected to be experienced, even trained by prostitutes. In some regions, mothers or priests supervised the act, adding absurdity to the pressure. Scholars debate whether these rituals were symbolic among nobles or common across classes, but they underscored a truth. Bodies were property, not private. Church sermons hammered this home. Priests railed against lust, calling the body a vessel of temptation. Sex outside marriage was sinful. Within marriage, it was suspect without procreation. Medieval texts obsessively categorized sexual sins, positions, frequency, even enjoyment. Kissing with tongue could summon demons, and couples faced strict abstinence rules, leaving few approved nights for intimacy. Yet, the Church's own manuscripts depicted naked saints and demons, revealing a contradictory fixation on sex. Some scholars believe people internalized this shame. Others argue they nodded in church and lived passionately in private, as confessions and poetry suggest. Same-sex love, though condemned as sodomy, persisted in quiet defiance. Monks wrote romantic letters to brothers. Nuns formed spiritual friendships, and some men held secret mock weddings. Records hint at couples like John and William, living as husbands, or nuns like Agnes and Beatrice, whose tender letters survived. Scholars debate whether these bonds were romantic or platonic, but their coded language and resilience suggest a medieval queerness, thriving in ambiguity. Brothels, surprisingly, were legal and regulated, often city-funded. In places like Vienna and Paris, they wore red hoods, paid taxes, and operated beside churches. Augustine justified them as a pressure valve to contain male lust, protecting good women. While some sex workers found autonomy, others were trapped by poverty or coercion. Plagues or moral panics turned them into scapegoats, yet their revenue built roads and fountains. Scholars debate their agency, noting cases of women rising to power or retiring wealthy. Finally, women like widows, mistresses, and rebels defied categorization. Widows like Joan ran businesses, mistresses like Isolde wielded influence, and healers like Tilda lived independently, dodging suspicion. Women's guilds, like the Hop Sisters in Germany, showed economic power. These women navigated a world of gossip and accusations, finding cracks in the system to claim autonomy. Scholars debate how free they truly were, but their stories, woven into silks, furs, and crimson velvet, reveal a medieval world where desire, though punished, never vanished. Clothing itself became a language of seduction and defiance, whispering rebellion in a society that preached restraint. In the medieval market, a merchant displays fine Italian silk dyed blue with crushed lapis, thin and shimmering like water. It's meant for noble ladies, but its cut suggests more skin than modesty. Clothing was strategic, gauzy layers, plunging necklines and clinging sleeves teased just enough to distract. Sumptuary laws, enforced by church and state, tried to curb this. Commoners couldn't wear velvet, prostitutes had to don specific colors, and pearls were reserved for high earners. Women's low necklines were forbidden, yet many flouted these rules. A woman passes in a tight lace gown, her hips accentuated, golden curls peeking from a veil. Modesty on the surface, seduction underneath. Hair, deemed erotic by theologians, was kept covered in public, but unbound for lovers, scented and displayed. Men's fashion played the game too. Long, pointed polanes stretched past toes, condemned by the church as prideful and obscene, hinting at wealth and virility. Women's fitted bodices and herb-scented garments, rose, lavender, frankincense, signaled cleanliness or readiness. Sermons railed against silk as satanic and fur-lined sleeves as paths to hell, but the warnings only fueled desire. Codpieces, once functional, became exaggerated by the 15th century, padded and embroidered, sometimes shaped like animal heads or holding daggers, a mix of sex and status. Scholars debate whether they flaunted masculinity or concealed disease, as some held medicated cloths for syphilis. In courtly circles, clothing was foreplay. Lovers exchanged gloves, ribbons, or sleeves as intimate invitations. A dropped handkerchief could spark scandal. A poem lingered on a stocking's texture before mentioning a face. Clothing was both shield and signal, revealing and concealing desire. Politically, it mattered too. English women were banned from French styles during the 100 Years' War, tying fashion to loyalty. A green velvet gown with slit sleeves, seen in a tailor's shop, balances sensuality and expense, perfect for a noblewoman navigating courtly games. Yet, strict gender norms punished deviation. A man in a woman's cloak faced dung-pelting humiliation. Scholars argue whether fashion freed or constrained, allowing coded expression or reinforcing expectations. In a world of restraint, fabric spoke what words couldn't. As night falls, you enter a village gripped by silence, where fear of demons overshadows thieves or sickness. Here, desire in dreams was blamed on incubi and succubi, shape-shifting spirits who seduced in sleep, taking the forms of lost lovers or dead spouses. A shepherd whispers of a woman visited by a demon resembling her husband, leaving her shaken. The Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century witch hunting manual, details demons stealing semen to impregnate women, explaining untraceable pregnancies or nocturnal emissions. Dreams weren't private. Arousal could mean demonic possession, especially for women, who faced punishment for admitting or denying it. Some nuns reported visions of fiery devils or charming men whispering Latin, likely born from cloistered loneliness. One woman in Milan, tried for willingly sleeping with a demon knight, described him vividly, perhaps cloaking her desires in supernatural terms. The church amplified the fear, preaching that masturbation or pleasure invited possession. Yet, some medical texts blamed erotic dreams on digestion, vapors from the stomach, prescribing better diets over exorcisms. Scholars debate whether these demons were metaphors for repression, scapegoats for trauma, or stories shaped to satisfy inquisitors. A monk's marginal drawing of a winged woman, labeled Lady of Dreams, suggests fascination, not just fear. People didn't stop desiring. They gave it horns and wings, blaming the night. In a stone chamber, a medieval medical text, On the Secrets of Women, reveals a mix of anatomy and absurdity. It claims women needed orgasm to conceive, a belief that turned pregnancy into proof of desire, cruelly used against rape victims. Drawing from Galen, physicians saw women as inverted men, cold, wet, and leaky, with wombs like wine flasks. One text describes the uterus with 7 chambers, 3 for boys, 3 for girls, and 1 for monsters, influenced by stars or garlic. The 4 humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, govern desire, with women deemed lustier due to internal moisture. Female masturbation was sometimes prescribed, though socially dangerous. Men's nocturnal emissions worried doctors, seen as weakening or demonic. Virginity tests involved checking urine or laughter. Bold eye contact or loud giggles suggested impurity. Aphrodisiacs like roasted ants or goat testicle wine promised passion, while midwives' practical knowledge often went unrecorded. Scholars debate whether these texts were philosophical or practical, but they reflect a culture wrestling with bodies through myth and Latin. On pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem or Canterbury, piety met temptation. Anonymity on the road loosened vows, and towns thrived on pilgrims' desires, with brothels disguised as bathhouses. Crusaders, like Richard the Lionheart, traveled with washerwomen, euphemistic lovers. A soldier's diary recounts praying at Christ's tomb, then lying with a girl from Acre. Monks and priests, far from oversight, indulged too. One friar traveled with a cousin in a borrowed dress. Some brothels paid church protection fees, blending sin and sanctity. Women pilgrims, vulnerable yet bold, sometimes disguised themselves as men. A woman named Maria of Brabant wrote of desire sparked by men bathing in the Jordan River, confessing curiosity without sin. Scholars see pilgrimages as both spiritual tests and opportunities for indulgence, where mud and prayer birthed fleeting loves. In an apothecary shop, love potions and aphrodisiacs promised to stir or soothe desire. Yarrow with honey, toxic Spanish fly, or mandrake from gallows soil fueled passion, while parsley cooled it. Revenge potions aimed to weaken unfaithful lovers. Herbs like garlic or nutmeg carried coded meanings, and rituals, like writing names on bay leaves or hiding charm coins, sought fidelity or attraction. A quirky recipe used semen mixed with rose oil as a love salve. The church condemned these as sorcery, exiling women caught brewing them, yet recipes persisted, hidden in cookbooks or dress hems. Scholars debate whether these were chemical attempts, placebos, or rituals for control in a restrictive world. Desire found expression in whispered charms and secret brews. In a castle's great hall, marriage is a cold transaction. A young bride, her dowry of vineyards sealing an alliance, sits beside a gambling lord. Monogamy was preached but unevenly enforced. Nobles kept mistresses, while adulterous wives risked imprisonment or death. Eleanor of Aquitaine's annulled marriage to Louis VII led to a passionate, dysfunctional union with Henry II. Merchants fined wives for unapproved silk while keeping courtesans. In Italy, feuttari allowed platonic male companions for wives, often with unspoken intimacy. Clandestine marriages, sealed by consent and consummation, sometimes hinged on stained sheets. Polygamy lingered in shadows, with concubines or temporary wives. Scholars debate whether romantic love existed in these strategic unions, but letters show rare affection amid duty. Below the castle, a servant girl births an illegitimate child, unclaimed by its noble father. Such children faced precarious lives, sent to convents, fostered, or abandoned at church doors. Peasants paid bastardy fines, but shame lingered, especially for unwed mothers. Nobles sometimes raised these children as wards, their origins obscured. The medieval world judged, hid, or claimed them, as lineage and desire clashed in secret chambers.